and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, freethinkers, believers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings. And we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, you are probably in the right place.
Hello everybody, I'm Nikki Phoenix, and the talk today is called Boundaries, Ultimatums, and Enabling. When is enough too much? Before I get started, I'd like to say that if even a single one of you gets out of your chair to get a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom, I will stop talking and I will not start again until you are all sitting down and being quiet. Sorry, misspoke myself. What I mean to say is, by the way, if anyone wants to grab a cup of coffee, hit the bathroom or something, I'm happy to wait for a minute until everybody's ready, and then I'll start.
Can we grab that bag?
Yeah, please.
Sorry.
Yeah, of course. So I want to take a moment and contemplate the difference between those two statements, because they actually describe exactly the same behavior pattern. In both cases, I was saying I won't start talking until everybody's ready for me to start talking. But in one of them, I expressed it as this bizarre, threatening ultimatum. I won't say a word until everyone is sitting down and being quiet. And the other one, I expressed it as an opportunity. Everybody's welcome to take a minute, grab some coffee, hit the bathroom, etc., and then we'll get started. But they're the same action. I'm sorry, is it clear that one of those is a scary, threatening ultimatum, and one of those is a generous offer, right? Okay. So the thing I want to start out by saying is, there's not a linguistic, hard line, logical, I can prove it difference between a boundary and an ultimatum. There are differences of intent. There are differences of impact. Humans aren't strictly logical. If I say, I'm so glad to see you all today, versus I'm so glad to see you all today, completely different statements, right? I am, by the way, so glad to see you all today. But the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum is not anything you can point to words on the page and go, that is specifically, clearly, because it describes this set of actions, a boundary or an ultimatum. So what is the core difference between a boundary and an ultimatum? And my answer to that is that a boundary is intended to protect you and protect and promote your relationship. And an ultimatum is intended to control someone else's behavior, even at the cost of the relationship. And the bottom line is whether the intent of it is to preserve and to protect or to control. I'm sure all of you are aware how good humans are how good all of us are at fooling ourselves about our intent. So it's really easy, if you're not careful, to set a boundary that's really an ultimatum in disguise. And it doesn't actually matter it doesn't matter entirely how you frame it, how you express it. If your intent, lots of people are good at couching things in pleasant sounding words. But if the bottom line is you're trying to control someone's behavior, even if it costs you the relationship, even if it costs both of you happiness or self-actualization, then it's an ultimatum. It's about control. It's not about protection and strengthening and healing. That does not mean that every relationship is good and should continue. It does not mean that protecting the relationship is the primary goal. That's actually by the way, I'm going to get a little bit emotional at times in this talk because this is a very personal talk for me. I've been doing a lot of work on boundaries, ultimatums, codependency, consent, and relationships lately. So, if my voice gets a little trembly, it's because I'm feeling strong emotion. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think we need more examples of people standing up and going, I feel strongly about this, and here's why. But excuse me if my talking voice gets a little bit less, resonant and full, and gets a little more, I have feels, because I have feels. So, the bottom line for me is that a relationship must be healthy for everyone in it. It's not a healthy relationship if it's healthy for one person at the cost of the other. And not every relationship can be healthy. Sometimes you have to go, this is a relationship that is bad for me, or this is a relationship that is bad for the other person, and there's no way. If the boundaries I set and the boundaries you set make a non-overlapping Venn diagram, this is what I can give and tolerate, this is what you can give and tolerate, and there's no overlap, there's no overlap. And trying to make there be overlap by forcing the other person over here or forcing yourself over here, it does not work. So, the primary purpose of setting boundaries, and the reason they are so important, goes back to the classic, put your oxygen mask on first. Parents on airplanes are not told, put your oxygen mask on first, because they are more important than their kids. Parents on airplanes are not told, put your oxygen mask on first, because they should love themselves more than their kids. They're told that because if you're unconscious from lack of oxygen, you can't put an oxygen mask on your kids. Okay? Boundaries are designed, are intended, and are necessary to keep you safe and healthy and growing. There's an old saying, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. People are mostly familiar with that one? People have a right to swing their arms around, right? But my right to swing my arms around does not supersede your right not to be punched in the nose. Now, it's actually a little more nuanced than that. If you look at the law, if I walk up to you and I swing my fist a quarter inch away from your nose, I've just committed a crime. I've just committed the crime of assault. But I didn't even touch that person's nose. No, but you threatened them. You ran a high risk of touching the nose if they leaned forward a bit. You did an intimidating action. You were violent. So actually, my right to swing my fist ends some distance away from your nose, having to do with, how threatening I am and how dangerous the situation is, and whether I accompany it with a, oh my God, look at this, or a, you better watch out, Holly, right? And the interesting thing about boundaries in human relationships is that you decide where your nose begins. You decide that. I decide where I need to swing my arm, right? To give that little physical demonstration, I swung my arms. And there's Ruth, only, 6, 7 feet away from where I'm swinging my arms. Now, you can say, oh, well, that's totally fine. That's way outside arm's reach. Except, what if the person sitting in that chair is someone who's been hit a lot? I grew up in a family that did some hitting. Someone does this, and my adrenaline immediately goes up. My abdominal muscles tense up, especially if they're taller than I am. Not that happens much anymore, right? But this motion is a very frightening motion to people who've been hit. A couple of years ago, I happened to make that motion, and I hadn't realized that my son was standing really close to me. And he didn't flinch. He didn't tense up. It wasn't a threat to him. I felt so damn proud. Because I had raised a son who wasn't afraid that I would hit him when I did this. I'm not going to do that anymore, by the way, because it's scary. I guarantee you, in a group this size, there's at least one person whose stomach tenses up, even though I'm 20 feet away and making a gesture as an example in a talk. You know, the use-mention distinction, you know, saying a swear word versus, you can bleep that if you have to, saying fuck versus saying to someone, it's hard to do it because, you know, this is all the mention, not the use, right? But the use-mention distinction is really important. And still, if I raise my arm like that, there are people whose muscles will tense up because human instinct isn't rational. So if there's someone out there who has been punched in the nose, when I swing my fist, it's going to affect them differently than someone who's never been punched in the nose. And they know where their nose begins. And I know where I need to be able to swing my fist. I talk with my hands, I make big gestures. And if I had to stand like this and not make any gestures, I would actually be pretty persistently unhappy. It's really hard. I'm doing this right now. It's really hard for me to talk without using my hands. But there are some people, for whatever reason, for whom talking, moving my hands is frightening or disturbing. I'm probably not going to be able to have a long-term relationship of any kind with that person, because just being me is scary for them, right? And that's okay. It's not okay for me to insist on talking with them while talking with my hands. It's not okay for them to say, Mickey, you can't come to church anymore because you talk with your hands. But it's okay for them to have needs that are different from mine and yours, different from the average, whatever. And it's okay for me to have those needs too. This goes back to what I was saying about the Venn diagrams. If I really need to talk with my hands, and they really need people not to talk with their hands, then there's not actually a way for us to have a good in-person conversation. And if both of us communicate that clearly, then we can stop having those conversations without either of us being hurt or angry or scared or confused. Good boundaries, healthy boundaries, are about communicating with people in relationship-preserving ways where your nose begins and where you need to swing your fist. And being in a relationship or leaving a relationship with healthy boundaries is about hearing and respecting and acknowledging what the other people in the relationship are communicating about where their noses begin and where they need to swing their fists. An ultimatum is fundamentally about changing where someone else's nose begins, or where they are allowed to swing their fist. You have to stay in this conversation, and you have to be okay with me talking with my hands, or I will blank. Or even, if you keep talking with your hands, I will turn and walk away. That's an ultimatum. It's not actually an ultimatum because it's not negotiable or flexible. That's one of those things that's sort of a heuristic, an indicator, but not actually a hardline boundary. I may have a hardline boundary that says, if you raise your voice above a normal speaking tone, I will leave the conversation. That's actually an okay boundary to have. If voices raised above a normal speaking tone scare me or anger me so much that I can't be a good conversation partner, then I should communicate that boundary. But there's a big difference between, if you raise your voice to me one more time, I will, and when you raise your voice above a normal speaking tone, even though you may not be feeling angry, I experience fear, and I need to distance myself from the conversation. So let's find a way that you can talk without feeling like you're having to whisper the whole time, and I can talk without feeling like I'm about to be hit. Let's try to work out. Bless you. Is it okay to say bless you? Keep that up.
Is that better?
I don't know. Congratulations on expelling the irritants from your nose. So when you're thinking about whether it's okay to say something, and by the way, when I say relationship, just to be clear, I'm not talking romantic relationship. I'm talking any human interaction that happens more than once. You and your boss, you and your coworker, you and the person who reports to you, your partner, your child, your mother, your father, the speaker in Seattle Atheist Church. These are all relationships. They are ways of being related and relating to other people. There's some really interesting stuff just in that single word, relate, that would be really fun to unpack, but that's another talk, it's not this talk. But all of this stuff applies to all of your human relationships. If you have a boss who gets excited or angry and raises her voice like this, and you happen to have a nose that begins way out at, if you talk above a normal vocal tone, I get scared, that's something you need to address with your boss. And your boss needs to listen, acknowledge, and respect your boundary. That doesn't mean your boss has to not ever raise their voice above a normal speaking tone. It does not mean you have to sit there while your boss yells. It means that there's an issue to be addressed for the success of that relationship. I will say something important here. If you are in a relationship, a human interaction of any kind, where you cannot safely communicate a boundary, leave. And if you can't leave, and if you're still in that and you can't communicate boundaries, you probably can't just leave. Talk to someone. Don't talk to someone who's going to tell you, leave. Don't talk to me, because I've already said leave. Talk to someone you trust. Read up on it online, read up on good communication, read up on the signs of abusive relationships. Because if you don't feel comfortable communicating information about where your nose begins, whether or not that person is doing anything wrong, you are in an unhealthy place in that relationship. Because whether or not they are doing anything wrong, if you can't say, this thing is hurting me or scaring me and I need that thing to be happy, then the very best of intentions and the very worst of intentions on their parts alike, they cannot respect that boundary. If you don't have a little picket fence along the side of your lawn, then your neighbors are gonna step onto your lawn sometimes because they don't know where your lawn begins. So if you care about people walking on your lawn, and you are scared to put up a picket fence because obviously they'll come and pour lawn poison on your side of it, you need to get some help learning how to talk with your neighbors, or you need to get some help getting your crazy neighbors not able to pour lawn poison on your lawn. But it doesn't matter which of those it is. What matters is there's a problem there that needs to be addressed. Especially if you state a boundary and someone replies with, you can't say that, that's an ultimatum. Yeah, it's not clear what's going on there. Maybe you're actually stating an ultimatum when you think you're stating a boundary. Maybe they are using that's an ultimatum as a little red flag warning to stop you from stating your boundaries. But either way, it's not a successful interaction yet. So, talk to someone. Get some assistance. Ask a friend to mediate the conversation. If it's a work relationship, ask someone in HR to help you figure out how to talk to your boss about it. If it's a friendship, ask a mutual friend to sit down with the two of you and sort of translate. But don't just sit there and let yourself be silenced because you think bad things will happen if you speak up. Healthy boundaries are about communicating in your relationship where your nose begins. And then watching to see and working with the other person in the relationship to ensure that their fist stops swinging there. This doesn't mean, here's my boundary, oh, you crossed it, screw you. That's one of the warning signs. One of the heuristics for identifying an ultimatum is that it is intolerant of error. We are humans. We make mistakes. We have to be tolerant, not in the sense of ignoring or putting up with, but in the sense of having resiliency toward errors in boundaries. Sometimes that's because we don't always know what our boundaries are until they've been crossed. And they're like, oh, that was really unpleasant. I must have a piece of nose that sticks out there. That's okay. Communicate that. We may really clearly communicate a boundary, and then a day later, 5 minutes later, they cross that boundary. That may be because they intend to ignore the boundary and they're making sure that we are not willing to defend that boundary. Or it may be because humans have this weird tendency to poke sore teeth, right? Teeth, right? My tooth hurts. Ah, yep, still hurts. Oh yeah, it still hurts, right? Why do we do that? I'm not actually sure, but we do it. Just knowing that the person you're talking to really hates the word trash makes you more likely, not less likely, to say trash in the next conversation. It's a pink elephant, right? But at the same time, if you set a boundary and they constantly ignore it, they more often than not ignore it, they every 2 days forever ignore it, they ignore it, and when you say something about it, they go, well, I'm doing my best. And so all the examples like that are in male tone of voice. I don't know, funny thing that. But if someone responds to accidentally violating your boundary by getting angry at you for telling them about it, that's another red flag that something's not right here with how they are respecting your boundaries. Okay? Having healthy boundaries is a matter of letting the other people in the relationship know where your nose begins and working with them to keep your nose from getting hit by their fist. It's also another part of having healthy boundaries is knowing where you need to swing your fists and working with the other people in the relationship to make sure that their noses are not in that space getting bonked. And the reason those are both important is that there are ways to be tyrannical in a relationship by swinging your fists around willy-nilly. And there are ways to be tyrannical in a relationship by having an ever-expanding nose. And they're both unhealthy and tyrannical. They both make the other person shrink. They do not promote growth. If I'm out there controlling your behavior by swinging my fists around, I am not encouraging you to learn and grow. And if I'm out there going, oh, well, that's not okay, and why are you swinging your fist over there, and oh, you know, my nose is very sore here, and 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 here, that's probably also not helping you grow. I've noticed that most people talking about this have a side they are more concerned with. Most resources have a side of that interaction, of that pattern of making the other person small and controlling their behavior that they are more concerned with. And I am personally, I want to acknowledge this is acknowledgement of bias. I am more concerned by far with the kind of harmful tyrannical behavior that involves swinging lots of fists around willy-nilly. I think it's a much bigger problem in our society. I think it's something I personally need to spend a lot of time avoiding because I have very long arms. That's my bias. I also think it's important to mention and acknowledge the other kind, because generally the only people talking about that kind are the abusers. But it's still a real problem. So there's my bias on that one, and there's why I think it's worth talking about both. When you are in a relationship with another human being, let them know where your nose begins. Ultimatums tend to do that in very angry, threatening language. If you ever raise your voice to me again, so help me God, I will turn and walk out that door and you will never see me again. That's a warning sign. It's a heuristic that this might just be an ultimatum. It's not absolute. If someone has swung their fist into your nose 1,000 times after you told them where your nose begins and asked them to stop no, it's totally expected, rational, reasonable, and appropriate. On the other hand, there's also a question of why you would even say that. Just walk out the door now. You are not obligated to tell someone about a boundary and then wait around for them to violate it. There is no obligation in healthy boundaries to respond to every trespass and transgression against your boundaries with a gentle, clear restatement of the boundary and waiting to see if they do it again. It's actually okay to be like, that person has hit my nose. Each of the last 12 times I've told them where my nose begins. Screw this, and walk away. It's probably a better idea. So, when you're setting boundaries, think about whether the appropriate response is to set a boundary, or whether the appropriate response is to cut your losses and go away from someone who has shown that they can't respect or won't respect your boundaries. Side note, can't respect or won't respect. It doesn't actually matter. You have a nose. You have a right not to be punched in the nose. And whether they are swinging their fist into your nose because they have poor control of their arm muscles, or swinging their fist into your nose because they like to punch you in the nose, doesn't matter to the fact that you deserve not to get punched in the goddamn nose. There are times when you might be more tolerant. When a 1-year-old punches you in the nose while you're changing their diaper, you don't put them outside, you know? You go, well, that's what 1-year-olds do. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to make room for that. And you especially don't have to stop having the boundary because someone claims that they can't respect it. You get to keep having that boundary, whether they're able to respect it or not. And if that means that when you have that boundary and they do not respect it, you leave, that's okay. I guess what I'm saying is, if you find that something is hurting you, if you find that your nose is getting punched, do your best to make sure that they know that they're punching you in the nose. Try to do it with some flexibility, at least the first time. Try to work out a way that their arm swinging needs and your not being punched in the nose needs can both be satisfied. Try to see, am I actually protecting something and healing something by setting this boundary, or am I trying to control them by setting this boundary? Oh, another good warning sign there. If your response to having your nose punched is to say, these are the specific places you're allowed to swing your arm, you may be setting an ultimatum and not a boundary. Because if it's really a boundary, if it's really about protecting your nose, then anywhere else they want to swing their fist isn't really an issue. You can let them figure out where they want to swing their fist instead of into your nose. So if you try expressing it as, instead of, I need you to stop swinging your fists around wildly, instead as, my nose is here, please swing your fists around somewhere else, that's more likely to be a boundary than an ultimatum. Boundaries tend to be tolerant of error. But don't make the mistake of thinking you have to tolerate every error, especially if they keep happening, especially if they are handled with anger, especially if your boundaries are ignored, especially if you are constantly encouraged to shrink your nose. And boundaries do their best, within the limits of protecting your nose, to protect the relationship. Pretty much anything of the form, if you do that again, I will leave permanently, is probably better handled by leaving permanently now. If your actual response to a boundary violation is, if you ever do that again, I'll walk away, consider whether it's the right time to walk away without even saying that. Because that usually indicates that someone has so profoundly transgressed a boundary that there's no point in staying to talk over whether they'll do it again. They've already done it. You already told them, don't do that. That's actually where I'm going to just put a pitch out here for not domestic violence. If your partner gets mad and hits you, it's not okay because well, you didn't say I shouldn't hit you. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that it's not okay to hit someone that you claim to love. It's not a question of how many times you should forgive them for hitting you. If someone hits you, GTFO, they already violated that boundary. And you have better things to do with your life than sit around being the punching bag of someone who can't respect a boundary that basic. When you feel hurt, when your nose has been bruised, ask yourself, do they know that my nose sticks out here? Would a reasonable person assume that my nose sticks out here? Make sure they know that they have, but don't ask, is it reasonable for my nose to be here? Your nose is there. That's reasonable. The question is how you address that. Make sure they know that your nose is there. Talk with them to figure out how they can swing their fists not where your nose is. Try to keep the relationship centered in your communication, but not centered in having the boundary. Your need to not be punched in the nose needs to be centered, needs to be the thing that is important. Within the scope of that, try to stay focused on growth and healing and preservation, not on control. And if you're the person swinging your fist, center the fact that you just punched someone in the nose. Don't center the fact that your arm really felt like swinging, or how could you have known their nose would be there? You just punched someone in the nose. Wake up. Address the fact that you punched the nose. Get them an ice pack and tell them you're sorry before you start talking about your restless arm syndrome. The title of the talk was Boundaries, Ultimatums, and Enabling. When is enough too much? Just like only you can decide where your nose is, where your nose begins, only you can decide when enough has become too much. And you are free to decide that at any time. There are people who healthfully say, here is the boundary. Oh, they crossed that boundary, I'm leaving. Bye, Felicia. And there are people who healthfully say, wow, they're having a really hard time with this. I know I told them where my boundary was, but it's really being hard for them to not swing their arm there. I'll give them some more time to work on it. I'll talk to them about it some more. I'll offer some other strategies. Maybe they're really not good at keeping track of that. How can I help them keep track of it? Both of those can be healthy. But the second one is never, ever, ever obligatory. Both of those can also be unhealthy in the opposite directions. But they're both okay. So when is enough too much? When you decide it is. Communicate your boundaries. Tell people where your nose begins. Tell people where you need to swing your arm. Try to be flexible with them in finding a solution. Try to be resilient of occasional errors. And when enough has become too much, walk away. My best wishes to everyone here, including myself, on determining, setting, and respecting healthy boundaries.